Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment, but in the past everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier, whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that, and eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load. These machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, Group Policy Objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So, I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO, but what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate, so when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines, authenticate with which domain controller. All right, so these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here. All right, and of course you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So, we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these these four servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here. Make a little bit of room here. And I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'm gonna give him a frowny face and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody. It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's a small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that can expand across multiple machines across the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is. And with that is really where, cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section, we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. So this big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course, it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing, there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay, Infrastructure as a Service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this, of course, is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it Azure. Some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets. This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about Azure is with Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out. But it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Now, when you're working in the Azure environment, if you think about it, you've got all these different resources that you're adding and configuring, modifying, making changes to throughout your entire career in regards to the cloud. And something that obviously is very important is being able to monitor those resources and keep an eye on the different things that are going on, especially if you are noticing some performance problems or you've got some issues you need to troubleshoot. It's very important that we have a way to do that. And of course, Microsoft provides us with a feature called Azure Monitor that's going to let us do that. And in the beginning of Azure, Microsoft kind of had all these different monitoring capabilities scattered all over the place, and they finally sort of just combined everything together into one nice place known as the Azure Monitor. So I'd like to take a look at that, and we're going to look at how we can kind of hone in on some of the metrics that we've got going on in our environment. So here we are on portal.azure.com, and you can get to the Azure Monitor pretty easily just by clicking the menu button, and it should be one of your favorites automatically, but if not, you can always do a search in all services. So I'm going to click on Monitor. All right, and so here are the various things that you can look at, and the primary thing I want to focus on in this video is the metrics. The metrics are all the numeric values that Azure is gathering within the environment. And so if you with Microsoft Azure, they have what's called the Graph API, and every little, I always kind of look at it, I always use the analogy, it's kind of like Azure's got its little tendrils all over every single aspect of your environment, and the ability to gather intelligence, analytic data that's going on in that environment. Your metrics are going to be numeric values that can be high or low numbers depending upon what's going on, and with the help of the Graph API, it has the ability to build charts and visual diagrams to show you the things that are happening. So if we take a look right here on metrics, right out of the gates, it lets us select the scope. All right, and the scope is going to let us select what exactly it is that we would like to take a look at. And so, for example, if let's just do my storage account demo resource group, we expand that out. And let's look at our storage account here called Exam Lab Practice JC. I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit apply. And it now allows me to select like what kind of metric that I'm wanting to look at. Availability, which is the percentage availability for the storage service. I've got the egress, the amount of egress data, the ingress, the amount of ingress data. Okay, so this is going to include ingress from an external client, whereas the egress, this is include egress from an external client. And then success E to E, this end to end, and then success server latency. So you have all these different things. You have transactions, the number of requests made to the storage account. Let's click on that. And from there, you can look right here at the time scale that it's giving you on the particular day that you're looking at it, and the time frequency. I can also go forward with that. Go to earlier than that if I want. You can pick a time period that you want to look at. You can actually add filters to that. All right. You can select a particular property, maybe that you want to add a filter like authentication is equal to, and then a value like an account key that's maybe used, or maybe you want to look at SAS. All right. So the shared access signature. All right. So from there, I can kind of hone in on what it is I'm looking for. The big thing you got to think about when regarding anything in the Azure Monitor is, you have to sort of think about your environment, think about the things you care about, and decide what is going to be important for us to look at. And when you start, looking at these metrics, it doesn't really cost you anything to look at the metrics. But I will say that when you start monitoring things like virtual machines and on-premise servers where you have to install agent software in some cases to do the monitoring, that's when they'll start charging you a little bit of money, especially if you start saving the data and you want to store the data in Azure through a storage account with a log analytics workspace, which is something that lets you store it. That's where it's going to really cost you money. But the monitoring side of this stuff here doesn't really cost us any money to do. All right, so that's good. We have that going for us. It's not costing us much money to to go through that process. But gathering logs and storing logs, those metrics, that's where some of the cost will come in. But not getting into that right now. So all of these different resource groups I've got available to me, I have the ability to go and look at. For example, if I want to look at a VM destination, I have a Win Server 1 virtual machine. Click apply. You'll notice that the metrics that are available will be different depending upon what scope you're wanting to monitor. And so before I was monitoring a storage account, right? And now I want to monitor a actual virtual machine. So look at the options that I've got available to me. And it gives you a description of each of these. This is really helpful because, we've always been able to monitor metrics in the Windows world. We've had a tool called Performance Monitor for decades. Going back into the 1990s, we've had Performance Monitor in Windows, but the one of the biggest annoyances of it is you have hundreds of counters that are gathering metric data, but they didn't provide a very good description. And I feel like they've done a better job with Azure than what we had in our server environment. So we can kind of highlight and look at what these are going to do. And there's also some additional documentation on the Microsoft Documents website too that can provide additional information on some of these metrics that maybe you're wanting to look at. All right, so let's look at available memory bytes. Okay, so you can see the available memory bytes. I can see based on a time period here how much memory is being used or not used, depending upon when you've turned the virtual machine on. Keep in mind, I just turned the virtual machine on. I generally, when I'm doing these courses, I don't like to leave my virtual machines running, obviously, because it's costing money, right? So I generally will turn it on when it's time for me to, do these videos. But you can kind of see the period there. Now, the other thing you can do is adjust the time range. So last 24 hours, or if I want to do the last 7 days, let's do the last 7 days. All right. So you can see available memory. And of course, again, if I want to change that, I can. So go here, look at some of the other options that I've got available for me. Disk writes, bytes. So keep in mind, this is just monitoring Azure's virtual machines directly, gathering data. I don't have to install any kind of special agent software for that particular thing. Not when it comes to monitoring the metrics and all that, but it is possible to install some agent software for on-premise servers and all that. Which I'll talk a little bit more as we get into this with the agent software. But you know, so you have the various things you can monitor here. The scope, you have the metric namespace. In this case, a virtual machine, you'll have different namespace options depending upon the scope, and then the metric you want to monitor, and then aggregation if you want to see the count, the average, the minimum, maximum, or the sum, which is what I'm selecting right now. Okay, and after that, with that said, you can actually you can save this information. You can pin it to your dashboard. All right, so you say pin to dashboard. We'll just say it's got the default dashboard here, which is my dashboard. You could create a new dashboard if you want to call it monitor. All right, so you can create a pin there. So when they say dashboards, they're talking about this right here, right? So you have Azure dashboard, and there's the new one that I just created. So as you can see, you can actually create a bunch of, with your dashboard, you can put a bunch of things you like to monitor, and when you go into Azure, you just select this dashboard, and you'll have all these different monitor widgets that show up for you to take a look at each morning. So if you like to, I know for me as an IT guy, if I'm doing work for a company and I'm going to be there day in and day out, I like to, first thing in the morning, I get my cup of coffee, I like to sit down and I like to look at some of the statistics or the analytic data that I found through some of these metrics. All right. But all in all, you'll find, selecting the scopes and looking at the different metrics and stuff is pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Highly recommend you try this out. You can also save this information. You can download the statistical information into Excel, and it makes it very easy if you needed to share it with your boss or something like that. But definitely something you should try out. If you've got a production environment, you can try this out on. I highly encourage that. But it's they've made it pretty user friendly for the most part to get the hang of. Now, something else that's very common with Azure Monitor is that you're going to want to be able to log information. And that way you can gather this log data and then you can kind of peruse that at your convenience. There's a few things you should know. First off, if you go to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go to Monitor, and then you'll have the logs blade here. If it's your first time going into logs, you may be a little bit underwhelmed because it's kind of empty when you first look at it. There's like a video they want you to watch or something, just, depending, and it hasn't really got a whole lot to show you. Now, here's what I recommend that you start out by doing. There's a nice little tutorial, a page that they've got available for you. If you just do a quick Google search for log analytics tutorial, and if you scroll down, there's this thing called the demo environment that I highly recommend checking out. And the reason I recommend this is because it's got a bunch of data already populated that you can look at, whereas in your own environment, you may not have as much information to look at. So I just kind of recommend playing around with this demo environment first before you dig too much into your own. So if we click on this little demo environment here, all right, that'll bring it up for us. This is what it looks like. And again, they've already got all of this information available, a bunch of different types of little queries and things like that that you can run on their demo environment. Now, I won't get too deep into that just yet because I have another video to look at that. But in a nutshell, you can expand these out. You can double click on some of these things you want to look at, and you can actually run queries against it. All right. Actually, you need to click on the Queries tab, find the stuff that you want to look at, and you can run queries against it. And it's going to use something called Gusto Query Language to help you peruse through this logging data. Okay, but not to get too deep into that right now, I just wanted to quickly show you that little tutorial page and how you can kind of get a preview of some logging data that's already there. I want to jump back over to my own logs. All right, so jumping back over here,
to portal.azure.com, monitoring, and then, or go to monitor and then logs. And then here is all the stuff that I have available to me, which really, I have all of this, but I don't really have a lot going on. In order to pull logging data in Azure, one of the things they're going to want you to have is they're going to want you to have this thing called a log analytics workspace. So that's what I want to show you right now. I'm going to go here, and I'm going to click the menu button, and I'm going to go to all services. And I'm going to do a search for Log Analytics Workspace. All right, and there it is right there. So a Log Analytics Workspace is a container that's going to let you pull logging data in that can then be queried upon. Okay, so that's why you got to have it. You got to have this this Log Analytics Workspace so you can pull logging data in, and then you can query at your perusal. Now, this does cost a little bit of money, so you do want to look at the Azure calculator to get a look at it. Okay, so let's click Create. We got to specify a resource group. All right, I'm just going to store this in my VM destination resource group because maybe I'm going to monitor my virtual machines with it or something. Okay, so I'm going to call this log workspace demo, and I'm going to do this in East.js, and then we'll click next. If we wanted to specify tags, we could. We'll click review and create, and we're going to go ahead and create. And I'll go ahead and pause the recording while that's getting created. Okay, so that's done. Now what I'm going to do is we're going to take a look at our storage workspace here, our Log Analytics workspace. We're going to click the menu button here. We'll go to Resource Groups and locate the Log Analytics workspace. Again, I could have just went straight to the resource, but again, as always, I like to show you guys exactly step by step how to find something. So, all right, so there is my Log Analytics workspace. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. All right. Then we're going to scroll down, and we have what are called workspace data sources. So this is how you're going to link things so the Log Analytics workspace can store logging data. Okay. So we can link virtual machines right here. All right, so you'll see I have a couple of virtual machines here. If I want to link Win Server 1, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to click Connect, and it's going to go ahead and start connecting that virtual machine so that that virtual machine can log data into this workspace that I gather. Keep in mind, if you've been playing around a little bit, you might already have a virtual machine that's linked to a workspace, especially if you did any kind of the networking troubleshooting with logs. Maybe earlier in the course, playing around, you might have to disconnect it from a workspace to link it to this one. Also, if you've got any additional workspaces that you're not using, you probably want to delete those because, again, they do cost a little bit of money. All right, so as you can see, it is connecting. From there, I can go to storage account logs. If I want to link a storage account, let's go ahead and link the Exam Lab Practice Storage JC. All right. And then what exactly do I want to log here? I'm gonna link all my events here, and then I'm gonna go ahead and click Save. And so it is gonna, all the different events that occur inside my storage account, it is now officially gonna log that. This is a System Center, so if you have an on-premise server like a SCOM, System Center Operations Manager, or something like that, you can actually link all that to Azure, and there's some documentation on how to do that. Also, you got your Azure Activity Monitor, or sorry, Azure Activity Log, and they tell you that this, as Azure Activity Log, is no longer the recommended method to export activity logs into Azure. So the best way is to export using diagnostic settings. So they have this thing called diagnostic settings now, which you'll see it basically list out all of the different resources that we have inside of Azure right now. Okay. So, for example, I have my load balancer. If I want to click on that, it says diagnostic settings are used to configure streaming export of platform logs and metrics for a resource to the destination of your choice. You may create up to 5 different diagnostic settings to send different logs and metrics to the independent destination. So if I want to click Add to that, all right, what data would I like to log into that workspace? Okay. So I have auditing, I have all logs. I could choose these specific or this specific place for it to go. In my case, again, I want to store it on my log workspace here. And there are some other locations here. I'm going to say all metrics as well. All right, and then give it a name. I'm going to say export load balancing. Okay, and then I would click save. So that's just from a load balancer I had earlier, and I've now got that linked in there as well. So now if I go back over to the menu button here and I go to monitor, all right, my log, actually I think I've still got that up. My logs, it can now start pulling that logging data in, and then I can start running queries, which I'm not showing in this video running queries, but now that I've got those sources linked into a log analytics workspace, I can now pull data and view that information. I can have that data all saved to that log analytics workspace and basically peruse that information at my convenience. Let's take a look at another great feature that Azure Monitor offers, and that involves being able to set up alerts. So to get to this, we're going to go to portal.azure.com. We're going to click the menu button and go down to the monitor blade, and we're going to click on the alerts blade. Now from there, we can go right up here to the left and click create, and we can click create an alert rule. All right, we have to select our subscription, and then we're going to hit done, and then from there we're going to click next, and we're going to set our conditions. So our conditions are going to involve what they call signals, which are things we want to look for that potentially might generate an alert. Okay, so for example, if I scroll down, or better yet, why don't we look for, let's look for virtual machine. Let's do a search for that. And then let's see, add virtual machine, remove, capture, start a virtual machine, redeploy, maybe shut down a virtual machine. Maybe we want to know if a virtual machine has been shut down. All right, so we'll go ahead and select that. All right, and of course it's going to show us if there's any data in the last 6 hours. We can, of course, we can look at the last 24 hours if we want, see if anything happened then. Okay, but anyway, we can go down here. We have the event level, whether it's flagged as a critical, error warning, informational, verbose. You can select all of these. So whatever, in my case, I'm going to do all. So whatever event level that shutting down a VM might be triggered by. So then from there, I'm going to go to actions, and I can set up what's called an action group. All right. Of course, I don't have any actions groups, so I'm going to create an action group. From there, an action group, I'm going to assign this to a resource. Why don't we assign it to the VM destination resource group, which is where my VM is. If this is going to be a region, whether it's, you'll see here global in my case, and there's some other region options as well, but I'm going to go global. And then action group name, I'm going to call it VM alert action. And then we're going to click next. All right, and then it says, okay, what kind of notification do you want to do? I'm going to do so I could do Azure Resource Manager role, email the Azure Resource Manager role, email, SMS message, or push. And then from there, if I wanted to put an email address, cell phone number, all that, I can have Azure's mobile app associated with it, voice information. I'm going to do email, and we'll say jc@examlabpractice.com. All right. And then I'll go ahead and click OK to that. All right, I'm going to call this email JC. That's the name of it. We'll click next. So action type. So the other thing I can do is I can have action types, and a little bit outside the scope of what we're getting into, the thorough details of this, but you can do things like automation run books. You could have scripts that get ran, a bunch of different things. Microsoft has what are called logic apps. The event hub. There's various things here that I could have a type of action. In my case, I'm not gonna set any actions. I'm just gonna simply have it to where I just get alerted. Okay, because if I'm caring about the virtual machine shutting down, I just want to be alerted. So I'm then gonna click to review and create. All right, and we'll go ahead and click create, and it's gonna now create this little action group. That brings us back to our alert rule, and then we're going to go ahead and click details. All right, it says okay. So where are you going to store this alert? rule. I'm going to store it in the VM destination. What do you want to call it? I'm going to say alert VM shutdown. Give it a description if you want. There's also some advanced options here you can set. Add your own properties to an alert rule. These will be sent by the alert payload. So if it was being emailed out, you'd have some additional data that's going to be sent to you. But I'm going to click Review and Create, and we're going to go ahead and click Create. All right. Now let's go up and click on Alert Rules, and we should be able to see our alert rule. Keep in mind that sometimes when you do this, it can take a minute or two before this will actually show up. So just be advised that you might, if you do this, you might want to give it a minute or two. But you can see that our alert rule is now ready to go. We have set up this alert rule. If we want to go in and make some changes, we can. We can click on it, and if we want to edit it, we can. But you can see the information here that we've selected. If we want to go in and edit this, we can just click Edit, and we can alter the action information as well. You can't change the name. That's one thing they don't let you do. But if you want to go in and, like, for example, change the email information, you can click on the action, and you can alter that information. See here, if I wanted to do that, I can edit that, change the email address that it's going to use. All right. Okay, and so that is how we can set up an alert. So I encourage you to try that out. I encourage you to try to generate some alerts and see if you can get the alerts generated and emailed to you. All right, pretty neat stuff. Definitely something fun to play around with, and very, very handy. So I have something real quick here that I think is very helpful in Azure monitoring, and it's called Insights. Insights can show you very fast the different resources you have available and whether or not those resources are able to be monitored or are being monitored. So let me show you this real quick. Here we are on portal.azure.com. I'm going to click the menu button and go down here to Monitor Blade. This brings us into the Azure Monitor, and then you have under Insights. So these are the different things I can look at. Like, for example, I can click on storage accounts, and I can see the various storage accounts that I have available and that can be monitored or are being monitored. Here's the Exam Lab Practice Storage JC. You can see transaction timelines here, the amount of transactions that you've got. You can click on it and go straight over to that storage account if you want. You can click on the activity monitor or the activity log and see all the events that have occurred. All right. Let me go back over here to the monitor. And then from there, I've got networks. So as you can see, it shows me all the networking related stuff that I've got available to me. Network interface, the security groups, routing tables, all of that. I can look at the health. It's got health information for it. All right. And virtual machines as well. You can configure insights for various virtual machines. You can click on Analyze Data and try to gather performance information that's been gathered from your virtual machines. I actually turned my virtual machine off, but you can look at insights regarding that as well. So the main thing about Insights is it'll give you just a quick glimpse of all of your resources as a whole. I like to kind of look at it as like a 30,000 foot view, if you will, of your of all of your different resources as a whole and the things that could be monitored if you wanted to go through the process of enabling it. But definitely something to check out and drill down into and look at some of the different things that you have in your environment that you can monitor.
Let's talk about the Azure Advisor. Now, the Azure Advisor is basically a dashboard set of tools that are going to point you in the right direction on different pieces of advice that Microsoft is going to give you in various areas of Azure. Now, how do we get into the Advisor? Well, go to the menu button here, click the menu button, and then click on Advisor. If you, for some reason, you can't find it there, you can go to All Services and you can search for it. Okay, so here we are on the Advisor, and right out of the gates, it's going to give me an overall score, and this score is based on these different things here: cost, severity, reliability, operational excellence, performance, and then whether I've taken all recommendations or not. So they've given me an advisor score of 65%. All right. Cost, security, reliability, operational excellence, performance,
They're telling me the score categories here. I can look at it from a monthly, weekly, or daily. I can also adjust the filtering. If I want to see a particular subscription, recommendation, status, active or postponed, dismissed, I can filter even further. I can also, it says reserved instance configuration equals 3 years and 30 days. You can see that you can alter that right here if I want. I can look specifically at cost if I want. So I can go here and it says right now you are following all the cost recommendation. I could see a list of the recommended costs. I can click on that if I want. It'll bring me up to their document where they provide a list of things they would recommend. And then I can also go down to security. This lets me see what my security rating is. And it also gives me recommendation. Of course, it is called Azure Advisor, right? So it's going to give you recommendations on what you could do to strengthen the defenses of things here. And they rank the impact based on high, medium, low. If we go here and click on one of these, it's going to bring that directly up. And what's really nice about this is it tells me these remediation steps, what I could do to fix this problem. Okay, so that is the security blade for Azure Advisor. And then you have reliability. So this gets into providing some reliability factors, and you can see there's one thing they've got here: use NAT gateway for outbound connectivity, prevent outbound connection failures with NAT gateway. So they mentioned that. Okay, they give me the advice on where I should use that at. Okay. So that's another thing. I can learn more on that if I wanted to implement it. So, and again, the point of this video is not to get into the, to what all that is, NAT gateway and all that. It's just to show you that the advisor is here to point you in the right direction on things that you could do to make things better. Okay. I have operational excellence. It says I'm following all up, but it does give me the ability to see a list of recommendations. And I could read through that if I wanted to. All right. Here's some performance. If I've got some performance recommendations, if I got a bunch of virtual machines and things like that running, it's got some recommendations on that I could read about, and then I've just got overall all recommendations. So it pulls together everything, the security, reliability, all that, all in one place. Okay, so that is the point of the Azure Advisor. The Azure Advisor is just going to kind of point you in the right direction on what you should focus on. It's going to give you a score. It's going to give you a kind of a glimpse of how you're doing overall with all the features you have in the environment, and then whether or not you've implemented some of these extra features that can make things better. And then again, it looks at all that, kind of quantifies it all together, and gives you that score based on that. So ultimately, the Azure Advisor there is to give you best practices and recommendations to try to help your Azure environment be better and more secure. I'd like to now get into the concepts of working with Azure DDoS protection. So if you're not familiar with that, that's distributed denial of service attack, and of course that gets into where you have hackers on the internet that have usually botnets, which involve a bunch of computers that are infected with what's called botnet software. And what they do is they order these machines to attack maybe a web service or something like that on the internet to try to take that web service offline. Azure does provide basic denial of service attack right out of the gates for your Azure services, but they have much better capabilities than the basic that they provide if you activate what's called Azure DDoS protection. First thing to be aware of is just the pricing. If you go to Google or Bing and just do a quick search on Azure DDoS protection, you'll see this link here for Azure DDoS protection pricing. You can put in your region, put in your currency, and it gives you an idea of what you're looking at for this protection. So you can see their monthly charge includes protection for 100 public IP resources. All right, it's $2,944 a month at the time of the creation of this video, and then they tell you that there's an overage charge more than 100 public addresses of $29.5 per resource per month. Okay, and with that they provide you with all the extra protection that you can utilize. Now, some companies are already using, companies like Cloudflare and things like that, and that's fine. You can actually use those services, but it is great to have a built-in service within Azure that can do this. So how do we actually add this DDoS protection? So I'm going to go here to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go to all services, and just do a search for DDoS. and you'll see the DDoS protection plans. We're going to click that, click to create the DDoS protection plan. I'm going to choose my demo RG resource group, and I'm just going to call this DDoS demo. That'll be the name of my resource. I'm going to click review and create, and then create. And then I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording and let this get created. Okay, now that that's done, I'm going to just click go to resource. And at that point, I would start adding my protected resources. Now, because of the fact that this uses up so much Azure credit, I'm not going to go through the process of adding these resources. But as you can see, I can click add, and I can add my VNets that I want to set this to: firewalls, application gateways, bastion hosts, load balancers, NICs, virtual machine scale sets, and virtual network gateways. The other thing I can do is, once that stuff is added, I can actually go down here to metrics, and I'll be able to look at various metrics involving the monitoring of these services. I can also generate alerts involving these services. And lastly, I can go here to diagnose and solve problems. And if I'm having any issues and it's not working like it's supposed to, I can go through and use these troubleshooters to help me fix those problems. All right. And so that is how we set up the DDoS protection. Again, I don't really recommend that you set this up and start adding services and all that, because this will definitely start chewing through and burning credit in Azure. But that is how it would be set up, and then you would use these things to do monitoring. I'm also going to delete that resource. So I'm going to go to resource groups here, demo RG, pull up DDoS demo, and just delete it. All right. Again, just want to make sure we're not utilizing any Azure credit on that. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete the resource. I want to talk now about the concept of authorization. Now, in cybersecurity techniques, one of the very first things that you would learn as performing a cybersecurity techniques in an environment is this term called AAA. AAA, AAA stands for authentication, authorization, and accounting. Of course, authentication means the user, of course, has to prove who they are. That involves, again, if they're an Azure AD user just logging on directly from Azure AD, or if like an on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services user, or if they're coming from some kind of third-party service, maybe being authenticated as a guest. Either way, authentication is proving you are who you say you are. Now, the second A is authorization, which is the one I want to focus on right now. Authorization is basically giving access to something. And then the third term, being accounting, would be the monitoring and auditing and all that, meaning you're being watched, you're being audited, you're being logged as a user. But let's talk more about authorization. So when it comes to authorization in Azure AD and Microsoft 365, that is done by a couple things. Number one, in order for users to have access to licenses and products, they have to have you have to issue them a license. And licenses are a subscription-based system, and you'll find that the licenses are all linked to Azure AD. So you'll see the same licenses in Azure as you will in the Microsoft 365 side of things. So here I am on portal.azure.com. If I click the menu button and I go to Azure Active Directory, I can go down here to the licenses blade, and I can look at all products, and you can see all the licenses that I have available. Now again, if you're doing this with me, your licenses may look different than mine. That is not a problem. Don't worry about it. Don't stress, okay? But if I look at this, I have Enterprise Mobility plus Security E5, and I can see that one person has been issued a license. If I Office 365, same thing. One person has been assigned a license. If I click on these licenses and click on service plan, I can see who's been given a license, which is me. If I click service plan details, I can see what's included with the license. So how do you assign a license? You assign a license. If you come up here to license users, you can click assign, and you can assign either a single user a license or a group of users a license if you want. And that's how you're going to do that. So that is the first way you're going to authorize somebody. You're going to authorize them to have access to certain services. There'll be things that they'll get access to. For example, if we come back over and we look at the Office 365 E5 license and look at service plan details, here's all these different things they're going to get, like Microsoft Teams, for example. As soon as they get that license, they will have access to Microsoft Teams. All right, and again, if you jump over to portal.microsoft.com, you're going to see these same licenses. So if I click Show All right here, drop down where it says Billing, you have licenses. You can see the same exact licenses through Microsoft 365. Okay. Now, the other way that, of course, users are authorized is with roles, and I'm not going to get deep into roles right now. But if I go back over to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, and go down to Azure Active Directory, I can click on Roles and Administrators. And these different roles are what's going to give different privileges. So if you want to make somebody an admin, for example, if I want to give somebody the right to create user accounts, I have a role called User Administrator, and I can assign that role to that user. You will have the same exact roles over in Microsoft 365 side as well. Okay, same exact roles. All you got to do is go to portal.microsoft.com, drop down roles, role assignment, you'll see the same exact roles. All right. And then the third way we authorize users is through the different Azure resources that we're working with. So, for example, when you start getting into things like virtual machines and storage accounts and all these various things, when you do that, you will see, let me go to this thing called a resource group. So a resource group is like a container in Azure. I'll just create one called test real quick. And when you go to a resource group is what's going to contain objects, right, in Azure, like virtual machines and things like that. There's a blade called IAM, and the IAM blade is, you can go here where it says add, and you can add this thing called a role assignment, and you can give individual privileges to that particular resource. So if I was doing this on like a virtual machine or a storage account, I could say, well, you are an owner, that gives you full control, or you're a contributor, which gives you contributor ability, allows you to add stuff but not delete stuff, and things like that. And not give other roles, I should say, not assign people roles. So it's a step down from admin rights. You give people reader role, which gives you the ability to read data. Again, I'm not really thoroughly getting into roles right now in this video. I just wanted to kind of give you a sense of authorization. So those are the main ways that we authorize things in both Azure and Microsoft 365. We have licensing, which gives out the ability to access certain services and applications and features. You have roles, which gives admin rights, or you can give role privileges over just individual objects. Okay, so those are the main ways you're going to deal with authorization. That word authorization essentially means that you are giving access or access control over services in your cloud environment. We're now going to take a look at assigning roles. So you may or may not be familiar with the different access control models. So for many years, going all the way back to the paper-based documentation days, where access control was managed through paper-based solutions, there's been a lot of different models and strategies that organizations have used to control permissions over certain objects, as well as administrative rights over documentation. And one of the models we're going to take a look at here, this is the model that Microsoft sort of puts all of their focus on in regards to their cloud. It's known as RBAC, role-based access control. Along with that, there actually was some other models and some other models that can be implemented in your environment as well. There's a model called DAC, which involves discretionary access control, which is really just all about ownership. The owner makes decisions. And if you look back at Active Directory in the past, you may note that that's one of the main ways that we dealt with rights in our environment was based on ownership. So we would create a file, and if you were the owner of the file, you had full control over it, and then you could grant other people access. And you can still use the DAC model to this day in your environment if you want, and or in the cloud obviously as well. Now you've also got MAC, mandatory access control. Mandatory access control is where we're basing our rights and permissions on classification, labels,
being able to label documentation and classify it. And then, of course, when I think of MAC, I sort of think of the military because it'll involve things like security clearances, security levels. So, you know, like in the military, you have secret and top secret and all of that. And then finally, we have RBAC, which is the one we care about right now. RBAC is role-based access control. And the way that role-based access control works is the privileges or the rights that you're given are based upon the role you play in the organization. Okay, so there's two different ways you can sort of look at RBAC and manage RBAC in your environment. One is from a user's perspective, where we're granting a privilege over some kind of a resource in our Azure environment based upon roles. And then the other is from the administrative perspective. So RBAC is going to allow an administrator to grant other administrators privileges to things in your environment, control over your environment. This is going to include both Azure as well as your Microsoft 365 environment. What you're going to find is you've got a mix of roles. Some of the roles are going to be in the Azure portal, which is what we're going to sort of focus on right now. And then a little bit later, we're going to also focus on the Microsoft 365 side, where you're going to see that there are some roles that are specific to the security of Microsoft 365. Okay, so one thing I really love about roles is roles allow us to see exactly what privileges our users are getting, our administrators are getting. One of the annoying things about group-based access control, which, you know, going back years and years with ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, you might recall that you would create a group, you'd put people in the group, you would then assign permissions to the group and give them the rights they need. But then here's the problem. There was nothing that really documented what rights those groups had. I mean, you could go to the access control list of the resource, like let's say it's a file server, and you go to the share or the folder or whatever, the file, and look at the permissions over that file, the ACL, the access control list. But then the issue is you'd have to do that for every file and folder you wanted to see if you wanted to see if that group actually had rights to that object. There was no way for you just to simply go to the group and see everything the group had gotten access to. Don't get me wrong, there were some tools out there that could sort of kind of make this happen. You could actually make it happen with PowerShell if you wrote a script that went through, but you're talking loads and loads of processing power just to get it to spider its way across your environment to determine what rights that this group had. And so what can happen is you create a group, you grant it permission, you add people to it, and then over time more people get added to it, and it gets given more permissions and more permissions. Next thing you know, 5 years down the road, this object, this group, has gotten access to all sorts of crazy things in your environment, and you have no way really knowing. And it really got difficult. So you could kind of sort of achieve RBAC with groups if you created a hierarchical group. But and I'm going to tell you, as being a consultant all these years too, I can say that almost nobody ever implemented that system. Unless I implemented it myself, rarely did anybody actually design a group hierarchy that worked to achieve an RBAC system. Now, in Microsoft 365 and Azure, the great thing about roles, the way they've designed it, I really feel like Microsoft got this right. The way they designed it, okay, you create a role, you then assign the rights to the role, and the role records exactly what rights it has, and they're documented on the role itself. And they used JSON. Okay, if you're familiar with that, the Java language, JSON, and the way it works with JSON in this case with RBAC is every time a right is given, it has to be added to that role. So there's no way that the role can be given rights to things and you not know. Okay, and then from there you can assign identities to that role and give those users rights. So you could add users or groups or whatever you want to those roles. And of course, identities can have more access to more than one role. So if I have a user who needs to be able to control Intune but not control Exchange, or maybe I have a user who needs to control Intune as well as SharePoint but not Exchange. I could have this user given the Intune administrator role and the SharePoint administrator role but not the Exchange administrator role. So it gives me that ability to do this next thing, which is the principle of least privilege. So if you're not familiar with that term, that's another sort of cybersecurity term that you hear out there. Least privilege involves giving out the least amount of rights, but still allowing somebody to do their job. Okay, so giving out the least amount of rights, but still allowing them to do their job. All right. I do a lot of classes on military bases and things, and I know a lot of times I have to have them like vouch for me to get into the military base, and they give me a pass, and sometimes I have to be escorted in a building to my classroom, and I'm surprised I don't have to be escorted to the bathroom. But in those classes, that's an example of least privilege. They're giving me the least amount of rights to get on the base, to get into my classroom, do my class, and then leave. So I've had the honor of teaching a lot of military guys, a lot of cybersecurity classes, and all of that, and that's what always comes to my brain when I think of least privilege. But the logic is this. Okay, so if you've got somebody who only needs to perform a certain action, then you should give out the bare minimum rights that they need. Okay, as opposed to giving too many rights. All right, I'll never forget the very first company I ever worked for in the 1990s as an administrator. I was a junior level admin, and they're like, "Congratulations, you're hired." So I get hired, and they put me, they give me access to, this was an NT network, so I get access to a tool called User Manager for Domains. Some of you guys might remember that old tool. And I open it up, and I noticed that there's like 80 people that are domain admins, and I'm one of them. So they're kind of like, "Congratulations, you're hired." And then all of a sudden I'm a domain admin, and there's like 80 people that are domain admins. And I start looking through the list, and I'm like, wait a minute, that guy's a sales guy. You know, why is he a domain admin? You know what I mean? So that's an example of not using least privilege. And I think sometimes people in their environments get too much into giving these rights out when to just achieve something. The person wants to install programs on their computer. Let's make them a domain admin. That was sort of the logic. So you definitely, in today's world, with the amount of cybersecurity issues that we have, we definitely want to use least privilege. And Microsoft highly encourages this. And one tip I'll give you on the exam is that always assume they want least privilege. So if you're looking at a scenario where they're saying, "Hey, this user needs the ability to go in and make changes to Intune," okay, as an administrator, but you don't want them having control over the entire Azure environment, or even heck, even if they don't say that, assume least privilege is always what they want. Okay, that's going to be one tip I give you. So I'm not going to make the person a global administrator. The global administrator role is the most powerful role that you can have in Azure Microsoft 365. You basically have, as I like to say, intergalactic cosmic powers over Azure and Microsoft 365 if you're a global admin. Yes, you can control Intune, but you can also control everything else, and that's too many rights for people. Now, another thing that's really cool about our environments is Microsoft has implemented PIM. PIM is Privileged Identity Management. Okay, PIM allows us to achieve JIT, which is just-in-time administration. Just-in-time administration means I can give out role access temporarily. It can be scheduled, and it can go away after a certain amount of time. Another thing that can happen is a user can request permissions, request privileges for a certain amount of time if they need to. So, if you have an admin that's going on vacation and this person is the one who creates accounts, for example, and then you could give this privilege over to somebody else while you're on vacation. This person could request that access, get it for a temporary amount of time, utilize that control, create the account, and then of course the privileges go away. So just-in-time administration is all part of this privileged identity management, which of course builds upon roles.
So let's take a look now at how we can work with roles in our Azure environment. So we're going to start by looking at roles in terms of Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, and how it controls administration. So to begin with here, we're on portal.azure.com. We're going to click the little menu button here, and we're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. From there is a blade called Roles and Administrators. We're going to go ahead and click on Roles and Administrators, and you'll be able to then see all of the different roles that are available. Okay, so a bunch of different pre-assigned or pre-created roles that are built right into Azure Active Directory. Now, you will also notice a little green ribbon over some of these roles. Those are generally considered newer roles that that Microsoft has added. But there's lots and lots of different roles here, and the thing I always recommend is to kind of familiarize yourself with the type of thing you're trying to achieve in Azure, and then look for some of these different roles that might be associated with that. For example, if I was trying to give somebody rights to manage security in Azure AD, then I might look for the keyword security, right? So let's see if we can find that. And there you go. You've got 3 roles right out of the gates there that involve security. If I was dealing with the Microsoft 365 side of things, and I was dealing with like Microsoft Exchange or Teams, SharePoint, I would look for those keywords, right? So if we kind of look through here, you'll see there's Exchange Administrator, Recipient Administrator. If we look down, we've got a bunch of Teams related roles. We've got SharePoint. Let's see, we kind of scroll down a little bit there. There's SharePoint Administrator. You've got roles like Yammer Administrator, Microsoft's little social media thing they've got. Lots and lots of different roles here that we can look at. Now, the key to this whole thing, though, is just kind of understanding and getting a feel for what each role does. So, for example, if we're talking about security and we want to look at the security administrators and all that, we have the 3 different security roles. Let's start with security reader. You have a brief summary of what it is, but let's click on it. And then from there, we're going to click on description, and we can read what the description says. It says that users with this role have global read-only access, including all information in Azure Active Directory, identity protection, privileged identity management, as well as the ability to read Azure Active Directory sign-in reports, audit logs. It says this role also grants read-only access in Office 365. And if you look, or Office 365 security and compliance. But if you look, you can kind of scroll down and you can see what the role permissions are. So these are the different areas of Azure. You can kind of drill down and see, what areas in the Azure environment, as well as the Microsoft Office 365 environment that they're getting. And most notably, you're noticing that it says read access to pretty much everything. So you can see it says security reader, as you can probably imagine, has read access to things, right? If we click assignments, we can see if anybody has been assigned this role yet, and as you can see, nobody has, right? So let's go back over to this. And by the way, these little things over here called breadcrumbs. Click on those, or you can just click back. Let's look at security operator. Now you can imagine a security operator is probably going to have a little bit more privilege than a security reader. So let's click on security operator. Let's click description, and then it says users with this role can manage alerts and have global read-only access on security-related feature, including all information in Microsoft 365 Security Center, Azure Active Directory, identity protection, privileged identity management. I know we haven't really gone over what all that stuff is right now, but you can see these different items that you get. And then if you look, you can also see the privileges. You'll notice it doesn't just say read next to everything. So Microsoft Directory, Cloud App Security, all task, all properties, all tasks, create and delete resources. So you can see these different privileges that they're getting on top of all the read stuff that they're getting as well, which essentially security operator can also read everything like a security reader. You'll also notice that you have these additional articles. I always, recommend when you're working with Azure, Microsoft, one of the things that they're really great about that they weren't so great about with their older server-based operating systems that were on-premise is providing easy to get to documentation. Nowadays, Microsoft, while you're looking at the different components in Azure, they have articles associated with those that you can very easily just click on and read to get a little bit more information. But anyway, let's go back and let's check out the security administrator. Of course, you can probably imagine the security administrator is going to be a step above a security operator. So we're going to click on that. And then from there, we'll go to description. It says users with this role have all the read-only permissions of security reader role, plus the ability to manage configuration for security-related services, Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, Azure Information Protection, Privileged Identity Management, and the Office 365 Security and Compliance Center. And then you can take a look here, and you can see you've got quite a few different permissions here that are available for this role. Okay, so one of the big things that I highly recommend you do is when you are trying to understand certain roles, click on the role, click the description, read the description, and kind of skim through what those permissions are, and that'll definitely give you a good base understanding of what that role does. Okay, we've even got a user administrator role. This is a role that lets people create users. That's one of the normal things that an IT team might need, is they might need to give an administrator the ability to create and manage user accounts. But they don't want to give them the keys to the kingdom, as they say. They want to give them least privilege. So if you had like a junior level admin that was in charge of maybe creating user accounts for new hires, new people that have been hired at the company, this would be a good role. So if we click on that role, click description, it says users with this role can create and manage all aspects of users and groups. Additionally, this role includes the ability to manage support tickets, monitor service health. Some restrictions apply for, kind of sounds like an infomercial there, doesn't it? Some restrictions may apply. But it says, for example, this role does not allow deleting a global administrator. So you're going to notice that the user administrator role doesn't really have a lot of control over higher level roles like global admins and all that. So user account administrators can change passwords for users, help desk administrators, and other user accounts, and other user account administrators only. So doesn't, the higher level admin and all that, global administrator and all that, doesn't have, this role does not give you privilege over that. Speaking of which, the global administrator being the most powerful role that we have in Azure, let's take a look at it. So we'll scroll up just a little bit. We'll go to global administrator here. You'll notice that for assignments, you'll notice that I am assigned global administrator, and if you've created a tenant to play around with, you should also have global administrator privileges. So you have all the power to do what you need to do. So we click description. You can see here, big, huge description, which, to sum it up, basically tells you have access to pretty much everything. And then you can kind of scroll down too and look at the different role permissions that you got, which is a tremendous amount of different rights that Azure gives you. So again, you don't want to give this role just out to anybody. Okay. So another thing we can do here is we can click to create a new custom role if we want. All right. I'm just going to call this demo role. You can say, with baseline permissions, start from scratch, or clone a custom role. So clone from a custom role. So what you can actually do there is, if you've already created a custom role and you wanted to duplicate it and maybe create another role with a few additional things, you could do that. But we'll have to start from scratch because we haven't done that. We haven't created any other roles. So we'll click next here, and then from there we can look through all these different permissions. You can even do searches for permissions and select the permissions that you want. Okay. So, I could go through and just pick whichever ones I want just to kind of play around with this a little bit. But you can go through and choose whatever this role is going to do in your organization. You can pick the permissions you want to give. Then you would click next. Here's all the things that I've selected. I can click create. And at that point, I've now created this role. Now, the other thing you'll notice is that when you do create the role, you'll see it gives you kind of a little orange-looking cube symbol next to it, as opposed to like a green-blue type of cube. So that just indicates that this is a custom role. It also tells you over there it's a custom role. And of course, you can also, if we click on this and go into it, you can start assigning users to it and all that stuff if you want. And of course, if you go back to roles and administrators, we can, if we do a new custom role, you'll notice that from here, if I say clone from a custom role, I could do that, and then I could actually add additional privileges. So kind of like the security reader, if you had like if you wanted to give like a bunch of read privileges, and then another one would be like an operator type role, you could add some additional functionality to that if you wanted to. All right. So that is how we can work with roles from the Azure AD perspective. Now, the other aspect of roles is giving access over actual resources in Azure. Okay, so when you start working with resources, you start creating virtual machines, and maybe you're adding applications into Azure, and you need to give privileges over those. All right. So you're going to use roles to do that as well. So what we're looking at right here is just purely administrative roles over Azure AD and all the things that are connected to Azure AD, which is pretty much everything in Azure, as well as Microsoft 365 services. However, what about the individual items that we work with in Azure? Okay, so like for example, if I go here to this menu button here, and I'm going to click resource groups. Now, a resource group is a container that you will use to contain your Azure services. All Azure components, all resources in Azure must be kept inside of a resource group. Okay, so if I click to create a resource group, I have to select a subscription, and then I'm going to give it a name. Let's call it Roles Demo RG, which is just Roles Demo Resource Group, right? And then I have to select a region. That's the area of the world where the data center is, which is basically where the Azure locations are throughout the world. Microsoft has supposedly 60-something different regions of the world where their data centers are. And on average, they can have about 3 data centers per region. And most of the time, you want to select a region that's going to be closest to where you're working, okay? Because you're going to be interacting with these resources, or if not where you're working, maybe where users are working that are going to be most commonly using these resources, okay? And of course, another thing to consider with your regions is where the actual region is you select. Sometimes resources may be more expensive in that region. Of course, I'm not really getting into this right now, but I will get into this concept of, if you think about cost and all that, there is ways to check to see what the cost of different resources are. But I'm not really talking about that right now. So I'm just going to select the, in this case, the East US region, which is closest sort of where I'm at. And then at that point, I'm going to click, I'm not talking about tags right now, but I'm going to click Review and Create, and then I'm going to click to create, and you should then at that point have a resource group, okay? It's one of the fastest things you can create in Azure, but the point of this isn't really to explain resource groups a whole lot. I want to talk mostly about the access control. So a resource group is a container that can contain resources. This will be things like virtual machines and all of that, but you have to give access to those resources, right? So what you're going to find is that the different resource groups, as well as the different resources, have a blade called IAM, okay? IAM. Now, if you're not familiar with what IAM stands for, it stands for Identity and Access Management. So you'll see that right here. It says Access Control, but the actual acronym IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So we're going to click on that, and then from there, you can see that it says check access. I can say view my access, which will show you, what level of access somebody has been given, or you have been given. In this case, I've been given owner access over this resource. All right. So you can see my privilege. Pretty much owner access is the highest level access you can get, right? It says you also are user access administrator as well. And this is because it's all been inherited from from the fact that you're a global admin and you created the role, or created the resource group. Okay. We can click on role assignments, and we can see what role assignments that we've got in here. All right. So from here, mostly what you're going to see here, it says items. There's 2 users, 1 service principal, and 9 managed identities. all this stuff here, not really getting into what all this is right now. This is the Kubernetes side of things, which gets into the being able to manage a large amount of virtual machines and all that. But what I want to look at down here, you'll notice the John Christopher is the owner. These are our user-related services. Now, again, not that I won't eventually talk about some of this other stuff here, but just you can kind of ignore that right now because we're not talking about Kubernetes and the services involved and all of that. But what I want to mostly focus on is my users that have been added. So, and this was added automatically because I was the one who created the resource group. Okay, I'm going to click on roles, and you can see all the roles that are available. These are different privileges that can be given out. Okay. The owner privilege is the most powerful role you can give somebody because basically they can do anything they want if they are the owner of something, including delete it if they want, right? And then you've got contributor, right? Contributor is somebody that can they can add things, they can modify things, but it doesn't necessarily give them the ability to delete everything. And then you've got the reader role, which gives them the ability to read stuff, okay? So you have all these different roles, and if we click on, if we click add right here, we can say add role assignment if we want, and you can choose from these different built-in roles, and you can also click view details, and it shows you the privileges. So I know that's one of the things that gets a little confusing is you're like, well, it gives me a basic description here of what this role does, but how do I see everything it can do? Well, you can see everything it can do by clicking this little view button right here. And then from there, you can look through all these different privileges that are given to this user, okay, or given to this role. And it basically, if you assign the role to a user or to a group, you're giving out all those privileges to that user or to that group. So the owner, as you can see here, the owner has the majority, the most amount of privileges of all. Okay, so one little homework assignment for you, you can go through and just kind of skim through these different roles and just kind of familiarize yourself with all these different permissions. There's a lot of different ones. Now, I'm not saying you need to go through and read what all these are. There are lots of these that are related to applications and Kubernetes and things that we're not talking about in this video, okay? But definitely the main thing to do is to familiarize yourself with these three roles: owner, contributor, and reader. Those would be the three I would recommend, okay? Now, the other thing you can do, not only can you assign somebody these roles, right? So you can go through and say, okay, I want to make somebody a contributor, so we'll go next, and we say, okay, is it going to be a user, group, or service principal? Service principal will be some of the different services that are available in Azure, which I'll talk about later, or some kind of a managed identity, a specific identity that I want to specify, which, again, not really talking about managed identities in this video either. But I could then go through and say, okay, well, I want to assign a specific person, a specific member. Maybe this is going to be Larry Thomas, select, right? And we're going to go ahead and review and assign. We're going to give Larry Thomas the ability to be a contributor. So he's now a contributor of this, okay? Now, the other thing you can do is when it comes to adding roles, if you click add, you can create a custom role, right? So custom role name, I'm just going to call this custom demo. You can clone a existing role, right? Like contributor, or let's do reader. Clone reader, start from scratch, or do JSON JavaScript object notation, which I'm not talking about in this video, but this is a scripting language you can use. From there, click next, and I'm giving this read, and I can add permissions to that. All right, so here's all these different permissions that you could add. You could familiarize yourself with these, okay? All right. Go here to Microsoft Purview, which is going to involve what's called compliance and stuff like that. In Azure and Microsoft 365, you could give privileges there if you wanted. All right, I know this is a lot and it's overwhelming. If you are somebody that is new to Azure, believe me, I could make it a lot more overwhelming, and I'm trying not to. That's why you'll notice that I'm not getting into what certain things are right now, but stay tuned, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that you're seeing, these different terms that you're seeing, that'll get covered eventually. You just got to give me time to get there on some of this stuff. But try not to let it overwhelm you, because that is one of the things that gets people. All right. And scopes, not talking about what scopes are just yet. So then this is the JavaScript object notation. Not going to talk about that right now. I'm going to click next, and we're going to click create, and we've now created a little custom role. Okay. All right. So that is how we can deal with roles. Now keep in mind that roles can be assigned at different levels. I'm assigning a role at the resource group level, so that means that the permissions that I'm setting here are assigning these permissions for this resource group, this container, and then everything below that container. Okay, keep in mind you cannot have resource groups inside of other resource groups. Okay, but everything is in this container. I would be setting permissions on it, right? If I go back over here to overview, or I'm sorry, if I go back over to IAM, the access control, right? You can see role assignments, any role assignments that you've got, roles that you've been given. Sometimes this will take a minute to update, but from there, that's how you can control roles on an individual object, and that's also how we work with roles in Azure Active Directory. I'd like to talk with you now about one of the coolest features to me that we've got available as far as controlling administration in our Azure environment. It's a feature that's lovingly called PIM. PIM is Privileged Identity Management. So, you know, traditionally with our identity management model, we're using RBAC, right, which is role-based access control. Role-based access control allows us to have what's known as a role that has all these privileges, and then we can assign that role to our different identities. Okay, but PIM takes things to another level. So what exactly is Privileged Identity Management? This is a capability that we get with Azure AD. There is a certain licensing for that, but I'll get to that in a minute. But it's something you get with Azure AD that essentially allows you to manage, control, and monitor the access to your resources in your organization. And then the great thing about it with PIM, this capability known as PIM, in dealing with the access control and the management and all that, it also allows you to control when and how long these capabilities are available to the users and all that. So it's a great feature as far as supporting who gets access, when do they get access, do they have to request access in order to get that role before they actually are able to gain it. Okay, so this is what PIM is going to bring to the table. All right, this model known as PIM, Privileged Identity Management. This model is sometimes referred to as JIT, Just-in-Time Administration. Okay, and the idea is to be able to help control the resources in Azure AD, Azure in general, which is the IaaS side of things, as well as Microsoft's PaaS and SaaS. So infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. PIM is going to play a role in controlling all of those things. Okay, and the goal here again is to control your administration. Not everybody is a global administrator. Global administrator has, as I always say, intergalactic cosmic powers over your environment, but we don't want everybody to be global administrators. And there might be times where we need to give somebody access to a resource or to control something for a temporary amount of time. It could be that you've got an administrator who is going out of town on vacation next week, and the administrator needs to pass along this ability to somebody. Like, let me give you an example. Let's say that I have a junior level admin who works with me. Maybe I'm a higher level admin. I have a junior level admin who's working with me. And this junior level admin normally does not have the ability to create user accounts. Okay, that's not something they have been given the authority to do yet. Okay, however, I decide to go on, or I'm going to be on vacation next week, and supposedly the company's going to hire a couple of new employees next week, and I'm not going to be here, right? So what I could do is I could make this junior level admin a user administrator, and then I could, go on vacation. I could teach or before I go on vacation, I could teach the admin, the junior admin, how to create users and all that, and then I could go on vacation.
The problem is I'd have to remember to take that role away when I got back. With PIM, with this whole concept of JIT, just-in-time administration, just-in-time administration is a great capability that says, here, you get this role, you get this privilege for a certain amount of time, but then it's going to go away after a while. Okay? And that way I don't forget. You know, if I was to forget, I should say, it takes care of it for me. I could schedule this user to have this right for a week, and then when the week is over, this power goes away. I could also make it where the user has to request this control through another user, like a manager or somebody, if I wanted to as well. Okay, so it's a great little feature. Microsoft has made it pretty user-friendly as well, so it's not too hard to set up. Really interesting technology that you can configure. Now, I will say this, as far as licensing it goes, you got to have Azure AD Premium 2. You have to have that P2 license in order to support PIM. Azure AD, Basic, Free, all that stuff does not support it. And you can actually, if you're trying to get a good grasp on, well, what am I getting with Azure AD Premium 1, Premium 2 license, Microsoft does have a great little website that you can look at to look at the difference. In fact, why don't we look at that now? Now, to me, probably one of the fastest ways to find information on licensing on just about anything with Azure is just to go to Google or another search engine, your search engine of choice, and just search for the keywords there. So, for example, if I search Azure AD Premium, and if you wanted to see like Premium 1 versus Premium 2, you just do something like that. It's going to pull it up. You can then go here to this pricing for Active Directory, click on that, and they give you a nice little website that's going to break it all down for you. So you can see each and every one of these options that you've got here. All right. So you have free, you have Office 365 app version, Premium 1, Premium 2, which is what we care about right now. If I scroll down, you can see that with Premium 2, you're going to get the PIM, the Privileged Identity Management. So you do have to have Premium 2, okay? All right, in order to support this. All right. So let's continue going over some of the facts about PIM. Some of the key features of PIM. So you heard me mention just-in-time administration. That's just-in-time privilege access, giving the user access when they need it. And then the time-bound thing that I was talking about. So again, if I was going on vacation and I needed this junior level admin to be able to create user accounts or manage Exchange or SharePoint or whatever, I can do that with a time-bound access. I can also enforce approval. So again, it might be that we've got another boss, another manager, somebody like that that's in town, but this manager isn't the one who normally creates users or anything. I can make it where the junior level admin requests to get control. At that point, this manager has to agree to it before it'll happen. You can also enforce multi-factor authentication. So whenever a user goes to take control of their role, when they go to grab that power, that role, they have to prove with MFA who they are. Okay. Another thing is justification, so you can require them to type something up that says, hey, you're justifying why you are gaining this power. And the user could put in there that, I'm justifying because I've got to create these 2 new employee user accounts, or I've got to create an email account or manage email or whatever, if it was for Exchange or SharePoint, whatever. So then you've got receive notifications. So whenever a privileged account gets activated, you can receive a notification that says, hey, this person has taken this role. Okay. And then you can also do access reviews. And access reviews where you go back through and you just make sure that your users still need the role. Even, it could be that maybe I granted that role for a month, but I was only on vacation for a week. So do I really need that role? Does that user really need that role that long? And then another thing would be to download audit history. The audit history is going to allow you to see exactly what they did with that role when they took that role. Okay. Now, there are some roles that are required for managing PIM. First off, only somebody who is a privileged role administrator or global administrator can control roles assignments for your other admins. So you can't just be anybody to control PIM. Okay. They also tell you here you can grant access to the other administrators to manage PIM as well. You can give, so that those two roles are there, the global admin and the privileged role administrator, but you could also create a role, give role permissions to some other role to come in here and manage your PIM settings. Okay. And then global administrators, security administrators, global readers, and security readers also have the ability to view assignments for that as well. So your security administrator, global reader, security reader, all that, they can't necessarily make a lot of changes, but they can go in there and they can see the changes. That's basically what they're saying. They can see who's been given those roles. Let's look at some of the terminology. Now, this is right out of Microsoft's knowledge base, okay? Right off their knowledge base, some of the different terms and concepts that you have with roles, okay? Before we take a look at roles, it's important to understand some of the terminology. So first off, you have eligible, all right? Eligible means that the user has got to go and perform some action to get the role, all right? And active, that's the second one. Active basically means the role is currently active. So they tell you here that, role assignment doesn't require a user to perform any action if it's already active. They've already got it. Activate means that somebody wants to activate the role, okay? So when you make that role available to the person, they have to go and they have to click to activate it. Assigned this is what they call a state. This is the state that a role is in, okay, as opposed to a type. And the assigned simply means that the user has been assigned that role and that role is active. And then activated, that's the state that a role is in. That means that a role is activated. So they tell you that if a user has an eligible role and they've performed the proper actions to activate the role, that role is now active, okay? Once the role is active, a user can go through the process of using the role for a certain amount of time. So that's the reason why it's activated versus assigned, okay? And then the last bit of terminology here, you have permanent eligible, okay? So they tell you this is a duration, but they tell you the role assignment is always eligible to be activated by the user. You have permanent active. So this is where a user can always use the role without performing any actions. This is generally what your standard roles are. And before PIM ever came out, that was how all of our roles were. We would assign a role and it would be permanent active, unless, of course, we took that role away from somebody, okay? You have expire eligible. So the role is eligible to be activated within a start and an end date. And then you got expire active. They tell you here that the role is where a user can essentially use the role without performing any actions, but it'll be within a specific amount of time. That means I've already given the role. It's going to expire after a certain point. Then you got JIT, just-in-time access. All right, and that model is the model that's being used here, as opposed to like a duration or something like that. And that's the model you've heard me mention in this little lesson already quite a few times. All right, so the user is going to get basically a temporary set of permissions for a certain amount of time. All right, the information is going to be granted when they need it. It's all going to be audited as well, what they're doing. Okay. And lastly, the principle of least privilege, that's the concept that's also a model for us to use, a strategy that we use here. And that's you always give out the least amount of privileges that allows somebody to do their job. Okay. So, again, if I'm going out of town, for a week and I'm granting a junior level admin the ability to create users, I'm not making them a global admin ideally if all they got to do is create users, right? Could I give them global admin control? Yeah, I could give them, as I say, the intergalactic cosmic powers over the environment. But why would I do that if the only thing that they should need to do is to create users? Sometimes we get a little carried away there and they're like, well, what if they need to do more? Okay. Well, you need to decide that from the beginning, but ideally you always want to live off of the principle of least privilege. And this is always something Microsoft pushes, in all their concepts as well as on the exam and all that, always the principle of least privilege. Okay.
All right, so hopefully that gives you a good foundation for what PIM is, the goal of PIM, the strategies of PIM. Let's walk through the process now of working with Privileged Identity Management, also known as PIM. Okay, so here we are in portal.azure.com, and I'm going to go to the little menu button here, and I'm going to click All Services, and we're going to search for Privileged Identity Management. All right, and there it is right there. I'm going to go ahead too, and I can just add that as a favorite by clicking the little star icon. So now it'll show up as one of my favorites here in my little menu bar. So I can just click on that, and here we are in PIM, in Privileged Identity Management. All right, and just kind of looking through some of our options here, I've got my roles. If I click on my roles, this is going to show me if I have any eligible roles. Okay, I can click on active roles, and this will show me my active roles. Now you can see I am a global administrator, so that's been assigned, and that's permanent. I'm part of that role, right? So if you go back over to our Azure Active Directory, just standard Azure Active Directory, you can click on your roles, and this is how we traditionally would add users to roles. We can see all the different roles that are available here, right? And I should be able to go through and see the global administrator right here. And the global administrator, I can click on that, and I can see that my user here has been given those rights. Okay, let's jump back over to Privileged Identity Management. All right, and so I've got my roles. You can see that I have active roles. Do I have any roles that have expired? No. Okay, so this is when you go into Privileged Identity Management, if you're clicking on my roles, that's exactly what that sounds like it is. You're looking at roles that your account has, not anybody else, your account. You've got my request. This is if I've requested any roles, okay? And then approve request. This is if I need to approve any request. I don't have any requests to approve right now from any users. Okay, so if any users have requested, if you've required a role to be approved, that's where that would happen. You can also click Review Access, and you can see if there's any particular access reviews of a starting time period or an ending time period that have occurred. You'd be able to see those here as well. All right, now here's where things get interesting. All right, I can go right here where it says Azure AD roles. So let's go ahead and click on that. All right, and I've got some options here. I've got assign eligibility. I've got the activate your role. That's if I had a role that was made available to me, this is where I could activate it. Assigning eligibility, I'm going to look at that with you in a second. That's basically assigning a role. Here's where you would approve request, and then you can also view history of things that have happened through Privileged Identity Management here. So you can click on View History, and you can see previous things. So as you can see here, I've added eligibility to a user and removed eligibility to a user, all that. But let's go back over here now. All right, and let's click on Settings. And you can see all these different settings that we've assigned or modified at the moment. All these different roles, as you can see, it's not showing that I've modified any of these at the moment. So this is what settings is going to do for you when you're looking at it through the AD roles. It's just going to show you if you've modified any. Okay, assignments. All right, I haven't done any assignments, but I could add an assignment if I want. Okay, so if we look at roles, we can see all the different roles that are here, and then I could choose a role like user administrator. We'll kind of go along with that junior administrator example. Maybe I've got a junior administrator, I want to make a user administrator. I can do that right there. I can click on it, I can add assignment that way. So that's one way you can do it. Another way is if you come back over here to Azure AD roles,
and you go to assignments, you can do it through here as well. So you click to add the assignment, and then of course you've got to specify the role that you want to assign. Okay, so you can do that you can do it either way. You can click on Azure AD roles, you can click assignments, and then it'll make you choose the role, or if you choose just the roles blade itself, then you can choose the role you want, like user administrator, and you can add the role that way, or add the user to the role. So I can also look at role settings, and I've got all these different settings, like activation maximum duration is 8 hours. You can require justification, require a ticket information on activation. So if you're using a ticketing system, you've got MFA, you can force that on the user. All right. You can allow permanent eligibility, or you can turn that off for the role. Okay. You can have a expiration. So you can actually edit these different settings by just clicking edit, and then you can actually go in and you can modify these settings very easily if you want. Okay. So I encourage you to kind of come in there and peck around. Here's where I could set a duration if I wanted to, for a maximum period that this person can get this role in hours if I want. So I want to, as you can see, it'll let me go, activation of 24 hours if I wanted to set that. On activation, require MFA, require justification. If you got a ticketing system, require approval if you want to approve. You could specify who the person is that's going to do the approvement, right? So you could set all of that very easily if you want. Like I said, they've made this very intuitive. They've made it a lot easier. They've actually improved on it. It used to be a lot harder to deal with a while back, but they've actually done a lot of work to it and made it a lot better. Okay, so let's go through the process. We've got a user named Chris Jones. We're gonna make Chris Jones a user administrator. So I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna go to roles, and we're gonna go down to user administrator, and we're gonna click assignment. All right. So the role's here, it's already assigned. We're going to click select our user. And we're going to find Chris Jones. There's Chris Jones. So we're going to select Chris Jones. We're going to click select. He's going to be our junior admin maybe. We're going to click next. And if I wanted to give permanent eligibility, I could, but I don't want to. So I could set a date. I could say, okay, this is going to expire. Notice it sets it to a year. Of course, if you went through settings, you could set it to only be available for 24 hours or something. But you could go through here. It's set to a year right now, but if I don't want to set it to a year, I could. I could go through here and set it to whatever I want. Okay, so if I wanted to go ahead and just say we're going to allow this this person to have access for a few days, we'll say till the 13th. 2020, we'll say assign, and Chris Jones is officially assigned. Okay, so we have officially given Chris Jones access to where he can accept it. All right, and in this next little lesson, I'm actually going to log on as Chris Jones, and we're going to take a look at how Chris Jones would accept it. Okay, so I am about to log on as my user Chris Jones at examlabpractice.com. I went ahead and opened up my browser in incognito mode so that it didn't remember my previous logons, and we could log on as Chris Jones as though we were that user, and we can test out the ability of PIM. Allow Chris Jones to go through and accept that role. Okay, so we're just going to sign in as Chris Jones. Okay, got my password entered. Going to go ahead and sign in now. All right, we'll go ahead and get logged in here. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to create a user as Chris Jones. So if we go to our menu bar here, we're going to go to Azure Active Directory. All right, we're going to click on users, and we're going to go and try to create a user. And as you can see, we cannot. Okay, we cannot. It will not allow us to go through and create this user. So we've got to get power to do that. We got to get a role as Chris Jones to do this. So we're going to go over here to the menu bar. We're going to go to all services. we're going to search for privileged identity management right here. Okay. And then from there, we can look at my roles. Okay. Chris Jones has a role that he is eligible for, right? Which is the user administrator. Okay. And it will expire a few days from when we activated it. Okay. So we're gonna go ahead and allow this user to activate the role. And we can specify the max amount of time the user can activate the role, okay, which from our settings that was configured in PIM, that was set to 8 hours, all right? So we can select that, allow this role to be activated, but notice something, it's going to require additional verification, okay? So the user is going to have to go through that process of MFA. All right, so at this point, we put in a phone number, and it's going to send a code to this number, which of course I have the phone, so I'm going to enter in the code. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and click to verify that. All right, so we've successfully verified MFA, and we are officially ready to activate the role. So we've got this one, then we got to give a reason. This is our justification, and we'll say needed to create new employee user accounts. So we'll put that in and we'll say activate. So it's going through the process of validating it all, and then it's going to hopefully officially activate it for us. Okay, so it took a minute to activate, then it went away, and from there you're going to notice that my user has this activated. You'll notice that the user has the ability to now go and create a user. So why don't we go and do that? All right. So this was the role that we could activate. If we look at active roles, you can see it is activated. That's the state it's in. So don't get confused, because a lot of times when people see eligible roles, they're like, wait a minute, did it get activated or not? Yes, it did. If you look right here, it's activated. Okay. So now let's go to the menu bar button here. We'll click on Azure Active Directory. And drum roll, here we go. Users, and we can create a new user. So as you can see, it did successfully go through. All right. All right. Well, hopefully that gives you a good understanding now of working with PIM. It's a great feature. It's a relatively intuitive feature, pretty easy to use. And you got to see it from the point of creating the PIM activation for a role, and then you've seen the user go through and add it. So hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding of how that works. And I encourage you now to jump in there and play around with it a little bit, look through some of the settings, and help wrap your brain around PIM.
Let's talk about a great feature we have in Azure AD and Microsoft 365 that can really help improve security in our environment. It's a feature called access reviews. Now, one of the things that we got to think about in our environment is scenarios in which maybe we have people coming in and out of different projects and teams and things like that. Imagine a scenario where your company has a project going on for the next 6 months or a year, and we've brought on some contractors as maybe guest users in our environment. And one of the things that can happen there is, as time goes on, we can totally forget that those people are still having access to our environment. So imagine a scenario where you're over a lot of projects, and you have one that's going to last a year, and you've hired 4 or 5 consultants that are going to be part of it, and then after that year their contract is up. And it's always your best intention to remember to remove these users after that period is over and they're no longer working on the project, or maybe extend their contract if it needs to be. But how things go, one thing leads to another, and we're humans, so we make mistakes and we forget. Well, with access reviews, we have means to try to trigger our memories and say, hey, it's time for you to review whether or not this person should get access. Let me show you how this feature works. Here we are on portal.azure.com.
I'm going to click the menu button here. We're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. From there, we're going to click on Identity Governance, this Identity Governance blade. And then you're going to see a blade called Access Reviews. We're going to go ahead and click on Access Reviews, and I'm going to click to create a new access review. Okay. So from there, it says select what to review. You can do teams and groups, or you can do applications. We're going to do teams and groups. And then it's asking, what is the scope? What exactly are we really wanting to review? Is this going to be geared just towards like Microsoft 365 groups with guests, or specifically teams with groups? Let's go with teams and groups, and then we can select the groups. All right. So we could choose whatever group there we want. In my case, I'm going to do this in NYC admins group, and it doesn't really matter if you don't have the same group as me. Just create yourself a group, or pick a group that you got just for demo purposes if you're doing this with me. Now, if you're not doing this with me, that's totally fine too. You don't have to necessarily. Okay, from there, scope, is this for guest users only or all users? So me personally, maybe I'm specifically targeting guest users who are like contractors or consultants that have been brought in. So I'm going to choose guest users. And then from there, it mentions down here at the bottom, inactive users on the tenant level only. So this would only focus on inactive people who haven't been logged on. But I'm not going to select that. I'm going to make it where all guests, whether they're active or not. So we're going to click next. Then it says, okay, determine review stages, reviewers, and timeline below. So I have multi-stage review. This is if you want there to be multiple levels of review. So you have a first stage, a second stage, and all of that. You can even add a third stage if you want. So it might have to go through multiple stages of review before finally somebody pulls the trigger and says, hey, we're going to remove this person out. In my case, I'm not going to do multi-stage. I'm going to select the reviewer. Do I want to do group owner? Do I want to do selected users or groups? So this would be like a certain person, like a project lead. Do I want to have users review their own access? So that's kind of interesting, where you have users who decide whether or not they should still be part of a team or group. And then you can say managers of the users. Okay. So I'm just going to go with group owner. And then it says fallback reviewers. So here it tells you to choose users or groups to perform the review if the primary reviewer doesn't exist. So the scenario where maybe a group doesn't have a group owner. So I'll just add myself for that. Okay. And specify reoccurrence of review. So duration is 6 days by default. We can set that to whatever we want, but I'll just leave it as default. And then review reoccurrence. So I'll do this, we'll say we're going to do this quarterly. And then we can have our start date. We can have an end date that says never. Okay. Of course, we could also set that to end on a specific date, or just do it on a certain number of occurrences. From there, it says configure additional settings, including decision helpers and email notifications. So I can say auto apply results to the resource. So if you look here, it tells you if the user's access is denied, their access to the resource will be removed after the review is complete. So I'm going to select that. All right. So that's the idea. If they get removed, they get denied to continue, they're going to automatically get removed. If reviewers don't respond, what do I want to do? So no change. I want to remove access, prove access, or take recommended actions. All right. Which ultimately recommended actions is usually going to be to remove something. Action to apply or deny guest users, remove user's membership, or block the user from signing into 30 days, then remove user from the tenant. So I'll do that. At end of review, send a notification. So who's going to be notified? I'll make myself be notified. All right. And enable reviewer decision helpers. No sign in within 30 days. So they tell you if this is enabled, the system recommends reviewers to deny users who have not signed in within 30 days. Recommendation accounts for both interactive and non-interactive sign-ins. All right. So whether they're logging directly on the machine and using an app on the machine, or whether they're coming in across the internet through cloud-based app or something like that. And then it says user to group affiliation. So they tell you if this is enabled, the system's going to recommend reviewers to deny users who have low affiliation with other users within the group. users should have a manager attribute for this decision helper to work. So as you can see, this is a newer feature here at the time of the creation of this video. Then some advanced setting justifications required. This means that somebody has to require a reviewer to supply reason for approval. So they have to have a type of message for their reasoning on what they're doing. And then email notification sends an email to reviewers when access review starts, and then also to the review owner when the review completes. And then you've got reminders, so it's going to send emails for in-progress access reviews to all reviewers during the midpoint of the review period. And then from there, I could also add additional content for reviewer email if I want. So I could put a text message in there for the reviewer. All right, once that is done, I can click Next. Okay, give this review a name. I'll say NYC Admins Access Review, because that's the group I chose, right? And then I'm going to click to create, and we've now officially created a access review. So that is how we can use access reviews so that we don't have situations where we end up forgetting to remove somebody that shouldn't still be there, like a guest. This is going to help trigger and remind us that, or remind the reviewer that this needs to be done.
Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.